Oh, I was going to say, here we go. Good afternoon, LinkedIn. Super excited to be here today with our amazing community hive, like our nonprofit hive panelists. Thank you guys for being here. Super excited. This conversation has been percolating for some time, and there's been a whole bunch of background chatter in a LinkedIn group about this for quite some time now, which is exciting. And so we're doing this to ourselves from the brain of Evan Wildstein, who has said this phrase a few times in the sector. So welcome, everyone. We are going to start things off a little bit differently today for our LinkedIn Live. Evan, do you want to explain what we're going to start with today for anybody who's just starting to join in with us?
Happy to do it. You all still hear me okay?
Yes, you're good.
Groovy. I'm setting my clock to 1 minute. So I'm borrowing this. I won't say stealing because she'd be glad for us to use it. But our colleague Megan Whitney, who I call the nonprofit mindfulness whisperer, practices this thing called Minute to Arrive, which is exactly what it sounds like. We know probably everyone listening and watching in just came from 6 meetings and you're taking these 43 minutes to do this and you're going to run to 6 more meetings and you've not really probably given yourself 60 seconds to just be. So I'm just going to start the clock real quick. Come to this wherever you are in your space and just be silent. Don't check your phone. Don't flip back to your email tab. Just be here. Close your eyes if you want, and we'll come back with you. But here we go. Minute really does feel like a long time. Thank you all for that. I hope you all enjoyed it.
It's a great way to start out, and very similar to what you just said. I think I had been in 5 back-to-back meetings this morning, so this is lovely. Thank you. Great way to start. I'm going to jump in. We're going to start introducing our amazing panelists for today. They're going to give a quick blurb about themselves and their work. And please, those of you joining us today, go ahead and start doing the same thing in the comments. Who you are, where you're from, and why maybe you're joining this particular conversation for today. So, Frances, let's kick us off. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi everybody. Frances Arias. I'm in San Antonio, Texas, but I'm the Director of Major Gifts and Planned Giving at McMurry University in Abilene, Texas, which is also my undergraduate alma mater. It's great to reconnect with my alma mater. I've been back for about a year now, but I've basically ever since I left McMurry, I've basically been working in higher ed and the nonprofit sector, I've always said my work needs to be meaningful. So I'm glad that we're here having part of the topic being about meaningful, change and stuff like that. But my work needs to be meaningful. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to spend this time with our friends and also our viewers to have this chat about what's going on in the nonprofit world.
Love it. Love it. Evan, do you mind kicking it off and telling us a bit about yourself?
Sure. Evan Wildstein, longtime listener, third-time caller. Day job, which is where you see now with this lovely faux Christmas tree. I'm the head of advancement for a great little Montessori school here in Houston, Texas, which is all things fundraising, community building, marketing, communications, and other stuff. But more broadly, my 22nd year in and around the nonprofit sector and just noticing all the things that we do poorly from the inside. So conversations like this, really personally meaningful. been involved for a couple of years in nonprofit staff retention research with a good friend and colleague, Michelle Flores-Vrin, and always just wanting people in decision-making positions, especially to be thinking about how they can improve the lot for the lot.
Awesome. And Julienne, please introduce yourself.
Well, my title is quite long. Julienne Torres-Hinds. I am the National Director of Strategy and Planning at March of Dimes Canada. I'm calling in from Burlington, Ontario. It's the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I have been with March of Dimes Canada for nearly 5 years, but have 15 years of experience, both in operations management and strategic management in healthcare, in the private sector and public sector. And like many of my friends here, both on the screen and off, landed in nonprofit as a place to, really put my heart and soul into the work that I was doing. So really excited to be joining this conversation.
That's awesome. Thank you, guys. And I think this conversation is so appropriate. I mean, Evan, when we discovered we were doing it on April Fool's Day, it was like, what does that mean that we're doing this on April Fool's Day about talking about the state of nonprofit work? But in many ways, the conversation that I've seen within the nonprofit hive, within the sector, does start to circle around a little bit to this. Are we doing this to ourselves to some degree? Yes, there are factors outside of the control of nonprofit organization. And, I think they may be increasing, or we're feeling like there's a bit of a bubbling up of things that are happening to us without control on our side. But I would argue there is plenty that maybe is part of a systematic way that we work in nonprofit that we could be examining, right, with a more critical eye for the future. So we're going to kick this off. I'm very excited for this topic. And the first person, our first question, our first idea is around this idea of internal change in nonprofits. And, we talk about it a lot. Is it happening? And, the big question that comes out of this is, how do we move from collective agreement and into actual accountability without it being more work for our entire team? Because I think that's where everything starts to break down, right? The whole team's stretched out too thin. What does that look like? And Frances, I'm going to post this question to you first. How do we start this?
So I think definitely the first thing to take into consideration with this is we got to acknowledge the fact, that there's shared frustration. That's the reality. We know that whatever it is, whether the change that you're looking at is whether it's bringing your departments together to create an event, or if it's bringing your teams together to, start working on your strategic plan. Whatever that is, I think as long as we all understand, we know that this is going to be a process, understanding that's being heard and understood, I think we overcome that obstacle, because then I think where we go from the collective agreement, right? We agree, okay, this is going to be a little frustrating. There's going to be a little bit more time that we're going to have to invest into being able to execute X, whatever that is. But from there, I come from an operations background, so I'm constantly thinking about processes, procedures, and stuff. And one thing that I've definitely learned, having been in the nonprofit world, is we want to make big change. We want to affect change at any level. And we think that it has to be grand. But when you get down to it, right, and you look at it from a team perspective, right, whether it's departmental or the overarching organization, you have to slice it down into pieces, right? So how can we work together, right? That's the question. How do we work together to impact by achieving those 1 to 2 priorities? What can we achieve? Let's prioritize it. This is, again, operations background. I think about project management. My division uses Monday.com for our project planning. It's a fantastic tool. It helps with, maintaining accountability and stuff. But again, if we really incorporate project management tools, clear communication within your teams, and being able to see how does that progress show in the big picture, that will help with facilitating that understanding of, hey, we know that there's going to be a lot of moving pieces that are involved in this, but if we can see how that progress is building up and building up and building up to that end goal, that's, I think, what's going to help with teams be able to maintain that actual accountability. Yeah.
Love it. Love it. If anybody has any other tools they love that you mentioned Monday.com, because we kind of gather some resources after the fact. If anyone else in the comments has some tools, Evan, how would you tackle this question, that collective agreement to accountability?
I do think that when I've seen this work well in an organization, if it works at all, there has to be a human being. Monday, utilities are really great, but I do believe there has to be a human being who is charged and trusted with this sort of thing. And it is not I remember one time that there was a conversation about an organization I was working with. We were trying to do right by our board. It was a huge board. And we were trying to figure out how to do a better engagement process with the board, which would have been additional work. And my question is, what resources are we able to make available to do this? And the response back was, this really shouldn't take that much effort. Let's just add it to the executive assistant's plate. Now, a really great EA, as we all know, has a plate that's, a cup that is overfloweth. And if a human being is to be dedicated to this sort of work, even if it's board development, if it's a new fundraising plan, if it's identifying a program, you've got to do the work as a decision maker. I won't say a leader or a manager, but if you're a mid-manager and you're responsible for someone who's going to be assuming project management for your department or something like that, which is something we're doing in my department in real time. This is something that is a skill that this person brings to the table, and it's something they're interested in doing, but it's probably an extra 2.5 hours a week, because we're in school year, it's an academic year. And so many departments flow through the work we do because part of our charge is marketing communications. There's no good conscience that any of us in decision-making roles could have if we say, oh, just add it to so-and-so's plate. It's fine. They can do it. You've got to be willing to take one or two things off. And I guarantee any nonprofit on this call, come find me on LinkedIn. I will work with you for free on how to cut things out, to put things on the chopping block, because you have to look at those things that don't serve the revenue, the mission, and the people. They might be legacy programs that your board chair, who's 609 years old, just really loves doing, but you have to be able to let go of things, have a little ceremony for it, light a candle, but someone's got to be responsible for it, and you've got to be able to help that person move administrative things down. You have to.
You bring up a really good point too, because saying, oh, it's only maybe an hour or two extra a week, that adds up over a month in a big way, right? And that's without any additional stuff coming into play, which we know happens. Like there's not the buffer, like, oh, okay, you've got a marketing department of 2 and your marketing colleague is sick. That doesn't get accounted for. Usually that one person now has to somehow pick up and still keep on timelines. Or I know one person, I love how she talks about it, Veronica Lafamina. Not sure if you guys are connected or following her. She's fantastic to talk about vacancy rate in nonprofit and how we are not adjusting expectations as people leave roles and no one backfills the role. And so, when we have a 40% vacancy rate at a nonprofit, we should probably adjust what we think we're going to accomplish by 40%. But that is the reality, is that rarely happens, right? Julienne, what would you add to this in terms of, that creating accountability and making that possible?
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick up a couple of threads there. I think that, as Francis has mentioned, that it's really important to acknowledge that there's frustration. In some ways, that's its own collective agreement, right? Having conversations like this is impactful because it allows us to move into a culture of actual accountability. And that's where I think the key is. It's creating that as a culture and not as a step along the way. It's something that's natural, wherein operations brain, I'm sure Francis can relate. I'm thinking of a racy, really, of what does accountability mean versus responsibility? Because it can be all talk where we say, it's everyone's responsibility, but who is answering for it at the end of the day? And how do we work together so that who is answering for it is not necessarily taking the heat for all of the change that we're doing, right? I think there's certainly a tendency where, per the question, there's collective agreement, there's a common sense of what we want to do, and then suddenly it's no one's job, or it is someone's job. I feel for designated change managers, who, it's the polar opposite of not having a single person. It sometimes is the one person where we say, oh, you're the change person, therefore it is yours. And suddenly they bear the brunt of all the work related to change, when, first of all, that's not realistic. And second, that is unfair. I think that, certainly there's some design in terms of how a change manager comes into a project or, an initiative. But everyone's got some sort of responsibility within it. I think it's hard to look at this question and assume there isn't more work unless you've done the work ahead of time to ensure that everyone feels that accountability is inherent, that it is not I think of the Spider-Man pointing meme where we go, no, it's your job, right? No, it's your job. And then it's unspoken, right? It's got to be something that is ingrained, in every single individual contributor, team member, whatever. Every single person in the organization needs to understand what it means to be accountable, what it means to be responsible, and how those two things go hand in hand.
Yeah. I love that. You guys just crushing the answer to this for sure. And there's even something, the collective agreement also comes down to, and this is going to lead perfectly, I think, into our next question, but the collective agreement may also need to be that this is going to suck, right? Like, hey, we're making big changes to culture or tech or, a slew of things. Let's all acknowledge this is going to be really hard 6 months as we do this, but there has to be some acknowledgement of that being the reality, and maybe addressing people's concerns about what their capacity is for things to suck. What do they need to maybe get through to the other side of that? Because I think that's something that we might be able to collectively agree that this thing needs to happen over here in nonprofit. We clearly have to change this. It's not working. But then, I know, Evan, we just have a cool conversation we had with Samira Mosby coming up about grief and like, what does it mean to be the board member who has to let go of this legacy project? And there maybe is an agreement that we're going to do this, but how does, there's also nonprofiteers are feeling people. I would actually say we're big feeling people. So how does that factor in as well? So this is going to lead in really well to this, risks and speaking up and fear of speaking up. How do we encourage cultures in nonprofit that truly support bold action and also honest dialogue? I'd love to hear what you think on that one, Evan.
Yeah, and the feeling part of it, we, pardon my French, but we've got to let that bullshit go, because we've known since like the early to mid 80s that passion alone has just been a thing that's not enough to pay people. It's rarely, in the staff retention research we've done and for-profit research that's out there, it's never really compensation that's top of the list for the reason people are disenchanted or that they leave. Like, you can't be paid poverty wages, but like experience and exposure have not for decades been the thing that keeps people. But I have sort of 1.5 what I feel are good stories to share for this particular question. Tosh, you've probably heard me tell this one a million times, but both quick stories are related to one another. So last year I went to a conference for people who do what I do in independent schools. And there was no theme of this conference, but the sort of tenor of the day was people feeling like they just had the capacity to do 7 things and they're always doing 11 things. So that net negative feeling going into it. And every session that came up, and I was the new guy, I kept raising my hand and just saying, like, we're doing this to ourselves, y'all. It's that kind of thing. So that's kind of where this came from. But one of the sessions was these 2 people who do fundraising for a school who got up there and were talking about how to really push through and persevere during annual fund season, which for anyone who's working in higher ed or K-12 education, it's a thing. And they had a cute slide up there with the picture of the corner of their desk and like how we get through. There was a picture of like Dayquil, NyQuil, Zyrtec, and all the other things. Like the God forbid we have to take a sick day corner of the desk. And everyone looked around the room at each other like we were waiting for Ashton Kutcher to jump out. Like, you're unpunked. This is not really how it should be. And then we got to the very end of the conference and I put my hand up and I said, can we, a small group of us, we were going around the room to see what topics people wanted to talk about, or they were calling it unconference. And the suggestion I had was, can we all get together and talk about doing more by doing fewer things? Because then we have to allow for space for the mess to come. And everyone was like, yeah, that's the topic of the day. And 0 people came to my table to talk about that. 0 people. There were probably 40 of them in the room. But who did end up coming, which was sort of funny and ironic, were the 2 people who got up there and were showing the Dayquil, NyQuil picture. And they said, we just felt bad that nobody came to your table. And I'm like, then I give up, because we can't, on the one hand, talk about wanting cultural change and being the ones who are loud about it on LinkedIn, and then we do the other thing. The 0.5 part of this story is about a week ago, I was working with a group of people here in Houston to put together a conference. And we were finishing up the call, and this particular conference, we're going to talk outwardly and openly about like managing our workloads and being right by ourselves. And at the very end, the person who had convened us said, now here's my cell phone number. You all can call and text at any time, even if it's 11 p.m. I am online and I'll respond to you. And I said, so-and-so. What? Like, how can we have this whole conversation for an hour and 10 minutes and still come to the table and just say, but by the way, I'm just going to shit that all out the window, pardon my French again. So I think the stories alone are where I want to take a little bit of a pause and say, the whole impetus behind the we're doing it to ourselves thing is, if we're not going to work as people who have influence in the way that we model the things that we're doing, there is no world where if we bring these values of self-care and guidance and health and all those things to the table, and those things gel with an organization's culture, we have to start that work inwardly. And I know that there are power dynamics that come into play with this. Some of the things I thought I would say here are power dynamics, cultural norms. There's no such thing as culture. There's just how an organization's value and an individual's value line up. The places where I've been the happiest, it's that 4 or 5 of my top values meet the organizations, and we work collectively to deliver on that for the mission. So yeah, just out of a little bit of frustration, I will pause and turn this over to someone next.
I was going to say, this is kind of perfect, because I was like, I'll put this together just in case. I don't know if I'll use it, but we actually, in preparation for this event, we actually purposely put this poll out on LinkedIn. And I would love to note that, yes, decision-making being slow and political was number 1, but the second biggest barrier to change was leaders that don't walk the talk. And, yes, accountability is on there. Fear of failure was on there as well. But one of those big things was like, I do think there, you highlighted something here, Evan, that, especially as we get into more senior roles and we could talk generational stuff. I've joked about being a first daughter, elder millennial, and what that means. And some people will go, oh, I've seen the memes. I know what you're talking about. But I do think, there is something to leadership needing to be ready to meet the moment. Yeah.
And let me say, I've worked for a lot of people who, doesn't matter the age. I've actually worked around a lot of Gen Z who are perfectly comfortable putting up reasonable boundaries, and they'll want to talk openly about it. It's not just like, I'm going to disappear for 3 mental health days and I'll tell you when I get back. It's like, that's fine. But I had that happen to me once, and I thought the person died because they just disappeared. But yesterday I was home because our kiddo was sick. Tasha, you know this. And I thought I'd have a good 90 minutes, 2 hours during kiddo's nap to get to a few emails and stuff. And my boss, who has very high expectations, texted me and said, you have one job today. That's to be home with and for your kid. Work can wait until Tuesday. Anyone on this call, I bet 8 out of 10 people would say that they don't have a manager who would offer them that space. So if that is not modeled for you, you're not able to take that and translate it for your team.
Absolutely.
It's very simple. It's not easy, but it's very simple.
I love that. Julienne, the culture conversation here. I know you started to jump into this, so I'm super excited to go back to what you were saying as well about that honest dialogue in particular.
You know exactly where I'm going, right?
I love this. It's so
You
great.
know, we can't talk about culture and honest dialogue without going into psychological safety. That needs to exist at every level. So when we're talking about leadership, when we're talking about leadership and their teams, psychological safety is so key. And in this question, really, the honest dialogue comes before the bold action. And sometimes it is the bold action to have that honest dialogue.
Ooh, I like that. That's
Right?
amazing.
That I
Yeah.
think, we can purport to have safe spaces, but do we know what a safe space actually looks and feels like for each member of our team, for each member of our leadership? Or are we making assumptions? Like, is a safe space right now very simply defined as here is an anonymous survey, or we don't, we'll have certain people leave the room so that you can speak. I mean, those are blanket recommendations, really. But do we actually understand the identities that people are bringing to the table? Do we understand the privilege that's at play when we create the psychological spaces or psychological safe spaces that we think we're making? There's a great blog post from Frank Velasquez Jr. on community-centric fundraising, CCF, about privilege and about spaces in nonprofit for people of color. So, as a racialized individual myself, it really resonates with me because it talks about how, there's essentially a constant state of fear for marginalized folks in nonprofit in most spaces, quite frankly. And let's be real about it. The nonprofit sector is a very white space. It's a very white space. Leadership teams are often white spaces. And again, that privilege is pervasive. There's a lot of code switching that folks like myself have to do. And when I say the word privilege too, I want to clarify this. And I literally read this morning, I think Jess Meredith on LinkedIn said, privilege is a lot like gratitude. It can stand along hardship. It's not mutually exclusive, right? So when I say privilege, it's not meant as an attack on my white colleagues and leaders and peers. It is simply a fact. It is a fact. And this sector would not exist without privilege. That is a fact too. We need to acknowledge it. That's bold action. That's an honest dialogue right there of let's acknowledge how that manifests for marginalized people at the table so that we can have a conversation about what it means to make a safer space, what it means to have an honest dialogue. What things do we not even put on the table because it does not even feel like a space where that will be heard, and that will be translated into bold action. Because certainly, I can speak from my own experience. I've walked away, metaphorically, from tables where simply don't have the energy to say a certain thing or bring up a certain issue. It's not the hill I'm going to die on. There's a lot of hills. I will say there's a lot of hills that folks will not die on because it is just not worth it. It's just not worth it. And we need to unpack that. We need to map out these hills that we've decided are not worth the time to discuss, because that may be the solution, right? It may be the way that we start to map out, what is that culture then that we want to create in order to create the next bold action, the next strategic plan, to do something radical and move forward from this abyss, if you will.
Oh my goodness. It brings up, first of all, you said that so beautifully, Julienne. That was fantastic. Two things I think, that brings up for me, but one of I was very fortunate to have a part in the Accelerate conference when, like, not this past November, but for the November before. And one of the most well-attended sessions, it was one of those breakout rooms meant for 20 people. There's 40 of us in there, because it was talking about how to be a leader and support neurodivergent, your neurodivergent colleagues plus, employees as a leader in nonprofit. And it was the most candid conversation. And some of it was very basic. What does even neurodivergent mean was a slide. That's fantastic, because it clearly some people needed that level of that conversation. But the honesty, the openness, as a parent, I started to bring up, even like, my son's only 12. This is a long ways away, right? That he's going to be an employee somewhere. But it was such a poignant and honest, it'd been one of the most honest conversations in this sector I'd been a part of at that time. And we need more opportunities for that around race, around disability, around all of these things that are, I always keep wondering what this sector could accomplish if we could go, oh, well, we don't actually really have an attrition issue at our nonprofit, and our fundraisers stay for years and years. Like, what could happen, right? Like, how is that affecting our impact too in this sector, when the turnover, because we're not willing to start with honest dialogue and then move to bold action, because we can't even get past the honest dialogue part, like you noted. Francis, what would you add to this about, the culture conversation?
I mean, as you've seen, I'm just nodding along because I completely agree. And I'm glad that you brought up the neurodivergence, because here I am with my little, toy, my little fidget toy. Because I mean, when I'm in meetings or I'm in conversations like this, I'm mindful that I have my own tools, but I'm also mindful of understanding who my teammates are, because there's the managing up, right, philosophy too, where you manage up to your managers and try and make sure that they have the information or the tools, whatever it is that they need. So you're managing up, down, across every way and stuff, but I'm very mindful about who it is that I'm interacting with. And I think that's kind of where, we want to be inclusive, right? We want to understand, we want to be able to empathize, but also to, I think, one of the things that I think that I want to touch on specifically that Julienne mentioned was, with honest dialogue, is all of us who work in the nonprofit world, we're advocating for something in some respect, right? But how are we advocating for ourselves? How are we advocating for our teams? How are we advocating for that internal change at whatever level we need to do that? And I don't remember who, I saw someone who made a comment about, when you're hiring for new positions into your organization, finding the right people, right? But you want to find the right people who know and understand how to not only advocate for themselves, right? Because when you get to the point of, okay, we need to execute X change process, right? Or project or whatever, can we have that open and honest dialogue about, I can't take on anymore, or I need to drop this off. I have to advocate for myself to be able to fully perform and execute for the overarching mission, because this is a piece of that. If I'm going to hold a piece of this pie, then I need to be able to advocate for myself, but I also need to be able to advocate for my subordinates. I need to advocate for what are the realities of this project, because in the nonprofit world, in any business too, also, we all have seasons. In higher ed, it's fall semester, spring semester. And then you've got the summer where it's kind of slow and you think that you can knock out really big projects, but no, you're actually like going 100 miles an hour because fall semester is coming up. So understanding your seasons, understanding truly what are those phases that your organization goes through, and finding those individuals within your team who know how to advocate, who know how to speak about what's going on their teams, speak about what's going on in their little world of their piece of the pie in what they provide to the organization. That's what's going to help be able to change the culture. because you can't just have one person come into the conversation and say, well, we're going to do this, without including everyone else's opinions and comments about what it is that you're trying to affect, right?
Yeah.
I've got to piggyback off of that,
Yes,
Francis.
please. That's
That
great.
I mean, brilliantly said. And what I'll add is that until you know, this radical culture of honesty exists, we need capacity to advocate for ourselves as well. That's almost something that needs to be built into our own plans, sort of in the back of our heads, right? That when we are prioritizing what we're doing for the next X number of years or months or days or hours, quite frankly, we need to create that space for ourselves to say, it's not just sort of creating these, a little bit of space for creative thinking and innovation and that sort of thing, but it's also does this innovation actually go inward as well? What do we need to do to, again, operations brain, make this work more efficient, make it more meaningful, and picking up on Evan's note there, what do we need to let go? We need time and capacity and space to think about that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Creativity doesn't do well when, we're rushed or we're exhausted, or Michelle Flores-Brennan has talked about this a little bit, but like, what are we sacrificing in terms of creativity in this sector when we're not given any time to actually be creative, right? And big outside the box thinking. Evan, do you have anything additional you'd want to add to this before I move on? I know this is an enormous question. We could have just done the entire LinkedIn Live around this, but yeah, I feel like it's just so relevant. You guys all said something different on the topic, which was great, and somehow tied it all together.
We're keeping it kind of like 5,000 foot version. We're all talking like slightly in platitudes. I am sharing a little bit of frustrations, which is funny that I don't see them in my current job. I'm a year into this role, and all corners of this place fully model and fully understand high expectations, but also what it means. I mean, this is an institution of young children. Like when a toddler gets sick and that's your kid, it would be so weird for a head of this school to say, I know your kid's sick and I know we rear children here, but like, you've got to, suck it up and come to work. I had a great thought and it's gone. Just that's what your brain does when your kid's 2 years old. Anyway, it'll come back.
No, that's fantastic. So I know we're going to go a little over time here, folks. And if anyone has any comments or questions, please throw them in. I see the comments keep coming in. They're fantastic. And there's no way we're going to get to our bonus question, which I knew was going to be a problem. But, this last one is really focused in on, there's like the staff division, and it's rooted sometimes in this idea of, but we've always done it this way, right? And newer folks come into orgs going, oh my goodness, what could we do if we were more efficient, if we had these hard conversations, and moved things forward? So, how do we bridge this sometimes enormous gap between institutional knowledge and these fresh ideas? And how do we create, like that culture conversation comes back in of like being valued on both sides? And Julienne, I'm going to post this to you first.
I feel like this is my soapbox. It's good. I think there's, in the spirit of acknowledging things, right? We have to acknowledge that we are in a multi-generational workplace. That has been the case for years. But, look at it now. It's 4, 5, 6, depending on the time of year. I think there's 6. I looked this up yesterday. There are 15-year-olds in the world trying to get their first jobs right now. Yeah, we have to acknowledge that and what that means. Like, make actual effort to understand, again, what are the identities that people are bringing to the table. And I love the idea of reverse mentorship, but I think there's something to be said for redefining it really as peer mentorship, if we're thinking of something tactical, right? Because when we start to think about those generational workplaces, or the workplace generations right now, rather, I think there's also an inherent assumption that the older generations are the ones who have the institutional knowledge and the newer ones have the fresh ideas. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are people with great ideas who have been in the organization for years and maybe just have not had the platform to share those, right? So we need to, eschew all those assumptions, first of all, make some, whether it's a program or, informal sort of employee resource group, spaces where, we are acknowledging that we work differently. We have different mindsets that we bring. Again, we could talk about this for hours, days. I recognize, as Evan said, we're talking in platitudes right now, but if we made a concerted effort really to surface both the institutional knowledge and the fresh ideas and know that they have, in a lot of cases, equal weight. It's not one or the other, right? They cannot exist without the other, really, because it puts every project that we're working on, every mission that we're trying to bring to life into context, to have, this is where we want to go next, but this is where we came from. Evan said something around, light a candle and mourn a little bit, right? Like, those are important. That's part of the change, right? It's important to acknowledge where we came from beforehand and allow people to not just understand the why of why we've got to turn this around, right? Or flip it over or inside out, or however, whatever metaphor you want to use there, right? We have to take the time to acknowledge where we came from, acknowledge what made sense at the time, and then acknowledge the circumstances under which we're, trying to evolve.
I love that. And Angie, I'm going to spotlight the comment Angie had here about, bringing the team together to brainstorm on an afternoon, right? Like, this is not wild stuff, but for some reason in a nonprofit, it seems bananas, right? Like, and you've got obviously remote teams that never went back in person, teams that are now being forced to go back in person. Like, there is a ton of upheaval in this sector, but that idea of like building time in for creativity, and absolutely something that I've seen come out of these nonprofit hive chats, is sometimes there are people who've just never been asked. They've never been asked to brainstorm or to, like, what do you think about this? They have great ideas, and I get that all the time out of hive chats where they're like, I didn't even know this thing I was doing was kind of outside the box, but someone told me it was genius. And they've never had anyone ask them. And how special is that to have a leader that gives you that moment, right? So Angie, love this so much. So cool. Evan, what would you add to this, institutional knowledge and fresh ideas kind of, and like, I guess, value, like, how do we drive value back into our nonprofit teams?
Well, and Julianne's correct. If you look at the sort of over 21-year-old demographics, there are 5 generations of folks who are working together. The folks who are in their 80s, who should have retired, but they can't financially for myriad reasons. But one of the things, and I felt this as I was reading Leah Krall's book, Innovation for Social Change, that, I do this to myself sometimes where, like, I've got a day with no meetings, and I'm like, at the end of that day, I feel like I've gotten nothing done because I haven't been burdened with the work that I always say we'd get so much work done if we didn't have all this work to do. Innovation is kind of a scary word because we think and we know that, like 3M and Google and these companies, like, we need to make that 20% of space available to come up with creative ideas. But innovation needs a definition. Innovation doesn't mean we're going to revolutionize the annual fund. Innovation could be, we're going to make the annual fund go from 8 weeks long to 6 weeks long. And what that's going to do for us is pester our community a little bit less. It's going to allow us 2 extra weeks to tally the data, use the data, look at it in real time. Innovation can be, as our friend Becky Endicott likes to say, 1% shifts. Doesn't sound like innovation, but if it's one thing you can do that gives you a couple hours a month, and then you could just be for those couple hours, don't need to fill that with immediately doing other things. But if you can just define innovation as what it could mean for your world, your circle of concern and your circle of influence, that's huge. And I bet everyone who's either an independent contributor or a manager on this call can say, you know what? maybe my weekly meetings don't need to be an hour with so-and-so. And maybe I could turn those meetings over to so-and-so, and so-and-so can tell me if they need to keep our weekly meetings. That's something I think every manager today should go and do. Those are not your meetings. Those are your direct reports meetings. Ask them if they need them. Tell them to run the agenda. You will find that both of you will free up your own time.
I love that. That's a really practical step too, right? And sometimes we just need that practicality is okay, right? Like innovation can be very practical, but we don't, yeah, I think it's how we look at the term, right? Like it has to be intense and it has to be at this point AI, or I don't, you know what I mean? Like, is it even innovating if AI is not in the language? Yes, it can be, right? So I love that. Francis, what would you add? Oh, sorry, Evan, do you have something else to add?
Just going to jump and say we had a board meeting a couple weeks ago and someone was talking about how in their business, which is this complex corporate thing, they have AI sort of over everything. And I'm like, I just need to figure out a way to not do manual entry of all of our donations, which is about 6 hours of my week during annual fund season. And then we can talk about AI. Innovation for me is just having the CRM do the work it's supposed to do.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree.
Amen.
Francis, what would you add to this part of the conversation?
I'm sure there's a whole other conversation to be had about how, and I'm guilty of this too, where we say, well, we need to treat nonprofits like businesses, right? And you use verbiage or terms like innovation, right? Where it's a very corporate-y business kind of term. But as you said, Tasha, like it can be practical. You're not building the brand new rocket ship. You're just trying to affect change for the constituency that your organization is supporting, whatever your mission is. And I also think I'm kind of derailing here a little bit, but the same thing applies for when we use the word philanthropy. That philanthropy means, you got to have a net worth in the millions, right? Where you can just give and give and give as much as you want. But philanthropy is not just solely people who have the means to be able to give millions and millions or even billions, right? And so, but I just wanted to touch on that real quick, but also to Angie's comment, and I'm really glad that she used that example because that's something that I've always been a very big proponent of with teams, is kind of like the in-service kind of practice, right? Where, like if you put it in terms of like a counseling, center or something, you've got your counselors that come in, you've got an in-service, you talk about the cases you're working on. Some of them might be easy. Some of them might be, hey, you know what, I need some help. I'm kind of thinking this, what does everybody else think? Those brainstorming sessions go a long way. And again, right, we're talking about value. How do I feel valued by this organization, by my team, by leadership? How do I feel like my skills and talents are being noticed and valued, right? And so having those brainstorming sessions where you can find the opportunity to use your voice and say, hey, I have an idea. It may be an idea that might seem far-fetched, but at the same time, you put it out there. Or it might be something that could actually affect change. We talk about, utilizing AI, making the CRM work for you versus you having to do all the work. You can use that time for more brainstorming, for more innovation, for, driving efficiency, and again, we're talking about that in terms of like, operations, but efficiency is across the board, whether it's the way that you engage with your donors or your stakeholders, the way that you manage gift processing, all of that stuff. And so finding those moments with brainstorming sessions with your teammates is just, I find that to be the most valuable because you have those individuals on your team too that are like the quiet mouses, who just kind of stick to their own little desk and their own little role. And it's like, no, I brought you onto this team, or you've been on this team for so long. I want to hear what you've got to say, because you might have that solution. You might have that idea. You might have gone to a conference and seen that, X, business has this new feature and tool that maybe we could, if we can have the find the funding for it, we can incorporate it and make life easier for all of us, right? So again, I'm just excited about like finding those brainstorming like opportunities, but I also want to say too that I know that having been a manager, having been an executive too, that setting those meetings, right? Scheduling those meetings, that's another task that has to happen. And I get that. But what you have to remember though is the value that you will take by having those cross-functional, collaborative conversations with your teammates.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's brilliant, Francis. And, two quick things off of that. One of the things that I often have talked about with other marketers in the sector, like we're horrible to market to ourselves, right? Like internally marketing to your team, you're the marketer and you're trying to like, oh my goodness, let's get the attention of all these people in this, that we want to be our donors. But you're not marketing even to your own team because your own team doesn't even know what everybody is doing, or like there's no gathering once, especially you get outside of very small teams, right? Like when you get into the bigger teams, it doesn't happen as often. And I think this also speaks back, Evan, to your social impact staff retention report, right? Because when we say the word growth, we often assume that by growth, we mean a bigger role at a nonprofit. Growth is not just a bigger role at a nonprofit, right? It can very much be like, oh my goodness, I contributed something huge to my team this year with this cool idea that I thought of outside like growth is not just your professional like your professional growth into like, well, now I'm a director. Like there's many.
Just a metric.
It isn't just a metric. Yeah.
Not just a metric.
I love it. Evan, did you have one more? I saw your hand at one point, and I know we got to wrap up because we're already over time here, and this was awesome, guys.
No one has anything else to do. This is, no, I was going to say so much of this conversation, especially the things my colleagues on this call have said, are reminding me, Tasha, of Jonah's episode for Good Nonsense. Yeah. Let's just call it what it is. People who look like me and just come to the table with the privilege that someone who looks like me has. You need to be, I think ally is a fine word, but I think the idea of an accomplice, someone who has some skin in the game, is really important. So if Francis and I are having sort of a backdoor meeting and Francis comes up with a great idea, and I just know, I'm putting you on the spot, you're probably not a shy little person, but if someone just like would never raise their voice in a meeting to bring up what you know is a great idea, have the chutzpah to say to that person, are you okay if I uplift this with folks, whether or not you're in the room? Because if it goes well, bonus for me, because the teamwork is great, and bonus for you, because your idea gets put on display. I do that radically and constantly here with my team, who might not get a word in edgewise for whatever reason. Usually it's just we run out of time. But you have so much positional influence, and a lot more than you think, especially if you're on this call and you look like me. Make sure you're uplifting the stuff that you hear from your people in that time you've made available for brainstorming sessions. I just think we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to the work too.
Oh my goodness, you guys, this was so fantastic. I was so like, I knew there was 45 minutes was never going to be enough time for this conversation. And I feel like we just like started in on a bunch of things. So I may have to have you guys back to dive deeper. This was wonderful. Thank you to everybody also in the audience who threw in examples and comments. And like, this was just amazing. And Francis, Julienne, and Evan, thank you for coming and doing this with me. It was amazing. Appreciate it deeply.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Thanks, guys. Everyone have a great rest of your day. Cheers.